Yo, what's up? My name's Petrowski, and I've been playing Magic the Gathering on and off for about 12 years and Legacy for about 10. And I'm the ripe age of 26 years old now, so when I got into Legacy, I was only 16. Now, I worked summer jobs to afford what I could, but no 16-year-old out there is swimming in Legacy Magic money. But I discovered very early on that it was the format for me. I think Legacy is beautiful. The interactions, the minute details, every single decision matters in Legacy. The timing of which you choose to fetch one land can make or break your tournament in a Legacy game. It can be a lot of pressure to handle, and unfortunately, it can also be a lot of pressure on your wallet. Legacy is fucking expensive. Always has been and probably always will be. With the average deck costing anywhere from 2 to 4 grand at the moment in the metagame, even get up towards that 5 to 6k range at times. How are new players supposed to get into this format when the barrier to entry is so high? Today, I'm going to do my best to lower that barrier to entry by showing you guys 5 Legacy decks for under $500. Or at least around $500, and also it depends on when you're purchasing those cards. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this does not remove the barrier to entry. It's still pretty damn expensive. $500 for a hobby is a lot, but hopefully that deck will last you quite a while. It's still a lot of money, but it's a good starting point to get people into the hobby, especially when other formats are ticking up in prices as well. At the moment, the average standard deck is anywhere from around 200 up to 500 bucks, which from my experience 10 years ago is still about the average price. Modern is pushing $500, $800, $1,500 for the most played deck in the format within at least the last 30 days, according to MTG Goldfish. I can promise you that many of the decks in today's videos are going to cost you less than a modern deck, and also present you with the tools to build further Legacy decks down the line. I think a really under talked about point of Legacy right now is that we are kind of moving into a staples metagame in Legacy, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is that most of the cards within a Legacy deck are relatively cheap. A lot of the cost comes down to a few massive chonkers. For example, the Underground Seas making up $3,400 out of the $4,300 cost for Dimir Reanimator. And things like Force of Wills, which a playset will cost you around $200, $250. If you are able to get yourself a playset of something like Force of Will, all of a sudden the cost to build every other deck is going to go down dramatically, if you're willing to, of course, unsleeve those cards and slot them into a different deck if you want to change around. And if you're paying 250 bucks for cardboard, hopefully you're willing to at least not be so lazy to where you're willing to switch around cards a little bit sometimes to play multiple decks if you want to. I promise we'll get to the decks here in a quick sec, but I want to touch on one more point, which is how to build your own budget Legacy decks. A lot of it is going to come down to experience, game knowledge, and all of those things that just take time and effort and energy, as well as understanding what is the point of attack. My point of attack through making a lot of these is going into things like monocolor or land bases that don't require dual lands. Dual lands are your main cost when it comes to Legacy, and a lot of the best decks are going to run them. However, we can kind of navigate in a way or still build very competitive decks that cut out those dual lands or replace them in some instances, although I really don't recommend just taking a top meta deck and swapping in shocks. I think most of the time that is not a beneficial strategy. However, sometimes if the deck is fast enough, you can actually get away with that, and you can still win a lot of games and go positive on the win rate. But that's dependent. Not every deck in Legacy is fast enough to just replace your duels with shocks, which may seem silly, but man, does 2 life matter right now. There are so many games I feel like that happen right now where someone is unable to now tap their Ancient Tomb because they've drained their life down so much. Paying 2 life for extra mana in Legacy is super worth it. Paying an extra 2 life when you could pay 0 just to fix your colors is going to set you behind a lot of the times. So only one of the decks we are covering today includes Shocklands. All of the other are full competitive decks in my personal opinion, which should give you good results. Let's just go ahead and jump into the decks. So if I ask you, when you think of lands in Legacy, you probably think of an extremely expensive deck full of Tabernacles. But what if I told you there was a new budget way to play lands decks in Legacy? Our first deck list today is called Turbolands, which was built by me over on tappedout.net with inspiration from tons of other lands decks in Legacy, as well as a bunch of the Lumra lands decks that Thraben U, aka Brian Gallagher, builds over on his YouTube channel. So shout out to him for some of the inspiration for this. Now, I lean into the more budget option here of Glacial Chasm as opposed to Tabernacle. And I think Glacial Chasm is one of the most powerful cards in Magic if you've ever played CDH or High Level Commander or just Legacy in general. I've been doing absolute shenanigans with Glacial Chasm in Legacy for the past decade with 12 posts. This deck is pretty simple to understand its goal, but at the same time complicated to pilot, and you must pivot over to other plans to be able to actually interact and adjust to your opponent's plans depending on what they want to do. Your goal is always to start with an exploration or a mana bond on turn 1 and dump as many lands as possible onto the battlefield as quickly as possible, and then use things like Life from the Loam, Mulch, and Winding Way to fuel your graveyard as well as more lands into your hand. Eventually winning the game with a multitude of things, such as turning a Dark Depths into a Merit Liege with Thespian Stage combo, using a Field of the Dead to create a absolute army of 2/2 black zombies, animating a Lair of the Hydra into a 20/20 or a 10/10 twice and killing your opponent that way, or using Lumra to beat down your opponent with a big Elemental Bear. Now, to a non-Legacy player, this deck may look slow, and to be honest, it is slow. It really has this crushing inevitability where the longer the game goes, the more likely you become to win as the lands player. Lands is typically really good about playing around control or playing around counter spells as well, since playing lands are hard to interact with. You cannot counter or respond to a land being put onto the battlefield. But how do you not just die to combo? Combo is really scary, and combo is really bad for lands, and the Legacy metagame is pretty combo heavy right now. Some of the best things are crop rotationing for a Bajuka Bog on turn 1, or in response to if your Reanimator player or Graveyard player goes for some sort of graveyard-based combo. I think having a Bajuka Bog main at least one with crop rotation right now is a must. Karakas to bounce turn 1 Tamios and slow down other legendary creatures, Mazavith to obliterate those Stifle-Knot players. Trust me, as a Stifle-Knot player, I hate seeing a Mazavith, let alone multiple across the table from me. And of course, Wastelands to slow down your opponent, arguably which there should be 4 of in this deck. If you want to try to cut other things to make room for other things or change any things in this deck list, I encourage you to do so. It's really important to have your own personal flair and like touches in Legacy. I personally won't play a Legacy deck or really a Magic deck in general without at least changing one thing. It's very, very important to me. So I understand if you guys feel the same way. Because this is more of a budget list, we actually do play slightly more lands than the average lands build. I think the average build plays around 30 to 33. We end up playing 35 because number 1, it's cheaper, and number 2, it enables all of our strategies a little bit better. I am notoriously not the best sideboard builder, but just off the top of my head, I think 4 Leyline of the Void goes into almost every sideboard right now in Legacy. Disruptor Flute is a solid catch-all, and then Force of Vigors to get those Blood Moons and other effects without having to be able to spend mana. And Choke because it's based. This deck initially had one walk-in closet in it over the Lumra, but I think I ended up opting out of the walk-in closet, which if you don't know is just a new green enchantment that essentially operates like Crucible of Worlds. It's 2 and a green and allows you to play lands from your graveyard the same way Crucible Worlds is, but it's a colorless card, whereas walk-in closet is green. I ended up cutting it because I felt like Light from the Loam and other effects were just enough to get like lands back from the graveyard, and it was kind of overkill. But if you wanted to throw one of these in here, I super get it. Someone could always counter a Light from the Loam, and obviously you can dredge it back next turn, but there are crucial moments where you might need to get your Glacial Chasm back on that turn 100%, just no matter what. And if someone counters your Light from the Loam trying to get that back, that could cause you to lose the game, as opposed to just using a walk-in closet or a Crucible of Worlds. If you try to then play your Glacial Chasm out of graveyard, they can't interact with that. Unless they preemptively countered the walk-in closet or Crucible of Worlds, of course. And I really can't just preach about how broken Glacial Chasm is here and how powerful it is. If you don't know, let me explain this very weird card that's definitely a just a product of old Magic. It's a card from Ice Age. Cumulative upkeep 2 life, which means it kind of goes up and up by 2 every single time. Fun fact, when I first started playing Glacial Chasm, I thought that cumulative upkeep meant it doubled. Keep in mind, I was 16. So I was playing Glacial Chasm in a way where I would pay 2 life, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16 while playing 12 post. And still playing, that was way worse for me. Still playing it incorrectly and playing it to where it was like much more detrimental to me. It still felt broken and was still very powerful. The way cumulative upkeep actually works is that it's 1 more counter each time. So you pay 2 life, then 4 life, then 6 life, then 8 life, then 10 life, then 12 life, etc. But you can also just let your Glacial Chasm be sacrificed to the cumulative upkeep and then bring it back with Life from the Loam and have an exploration or a mana bond to play multiple lands, making up for that missed land drop, because when Glacial Chasm comes into play, you do have to sacrifice a land, which is the most important thing to consider here. Now, Glacial Chasm says its big effect that all these downsides factor in for is you cannot attack, which doesn't really matter as long as you have Lumra, but it's something to remember. I've definitely forgotten a few times. I've kept my Glacial Chasm around when I should have let it be sacrificed so I could attack with my Primeval Titan in Old Legacy. And then all damage reduced to you is 0. All damage dealt to you is reduced to 0. You essentially can't die from certain things, not everything. If someone Thassa's Oracles you still lose. You got to be able to interact with that combo out of sideboard. If someone's playing that, that's just a sideboard matchup for turbo lands, unfortunately. If someone Tendrils of Agonies you, that is life loss. You still lose. Glacial Chasm does not get around Tendrils of Agony. However, you can crop rotation for Glacial Chasm. I cannot tell you how many times my opponent has played in a certain way just to squeeze out that little extra bit of damage. Hilariously, you can crop rotation for a Glacial Chasm in response to attacks. You can do it in response to a Fatal Lightning Bolt if your opponent goes for the final Lightning Bolt to KO you and you've used all their resources. You can crop rotation for a Glacial Chasm, stay alive for a turn, restabilize, and get back into that game. Glacial Chasm is truly the anime card in my opinion. I've had so many insane comebacks from 1 HP only possible due to Glacial Chasm, and no other card in Magic could have saved me the way this card has. Also, we should talk about the price. This deck is around 450 bucks or so on TCG Player and around 150 ticks on Card Hoarder. And all the links to these decks will be in the description, of course. All right, next up is not a deck built by me. This is just from an MTG Goldfish tournament where I believe this player got 4th place in a Legacy Challenge, going 6-2. This is Oops All Spells. And keep in mind, Oops All Spells is one of the most played decks in the Legacy meta game right now. Currently dropping a little bit though, to be fair, down to around 5%, around the 6th most played. Recently it's been as high as 2 or 3, in terms of the most played decks, like rank 2 or rank 3. So it's dropping a little bit. I don't know if people are worried of certain bans or something like that, but it's a very good deck, and it's kind of the premier budget deck right now in Legacy, usually costing around $900 for a fully powered up Oops All Spells list. However, this one I found is under 500. This one is 424, made by someone named Faulted Form. So shout out to you, man. I don't have too much experience piloting or playing against Oops All Spells. Back when I played against it, it was a Goblin Charbelcher build, and that's a huge point of discussion where nowadays a lot of times they sideboard over to Goblin Charbelcher, but let's just talk about general Oops All Spell strategy. I can still give you the decent basic breakdown. Generally, there's a few ways Oops All Spells can win from my understanding. The strategy usually boils down to getting out either an Undercity Informer that costs 3 mana and then paying the extra 1 to sacrifice it, and then it says target player reveals from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals a land card and then puts those cards into their graveyard. Or Balustrade Spy, which is a 4 mana card that does kind of the same thing, where when it enters, target player reveals the top card of their library until they reveal a land card. So Oops All Spells plays 0 lands, and your goal is to essentially get out one of these creatures, get off that effect, dump your library into your graveyard, and then using your 3 Narc Amoebas that are then milled into your graveyard, and then using Dread Return, flashing that back and getting Thassa's Oracle when your library is empty and winning the game. You also have things like Bridge from Below to create zombies, and you usually use things like Thoughtseize and Cabal Ritual or Pact of Negation to clear the way and then protect your combo. And nowadays, since we have MDFCs like Agadium's Awakening, Boggart Trawler, on top of Spirit Guides like Elvish and Simian Spirit Guides, on top of Lotus Petals, there's so many mana creating sources that now allow Oops All Spells players to get around not playing lands even easier. And considering how much graveyard hate is in the format, it's really important with Oops All Spells to have some sort of sideboard plan or just lean into the beat down plan. This is a legitimate strategy with Oops All Spells, is your opponent mulliganing to 6, mulliganing to 5, mulliganing down until they get that Leyline of the Void to get rid of your graveyard, and then switching to, okay, I'm just going to play a Boggart Trawler on turn 1 with Elvish Spirit Guides and, some sort of other untap, pay 3 life, flip land, and then beat you down with a 3/1 from that point forward. Beating down with these 2/3s, these 2/2s, the 3/1s from Poxwalkers, which can return from the graveyard back to the battlefield. As the Oops All Spells player, you have to have the beatdown strategy in mind, and you have to respect it as the opponent. They can get you on it. There is one cheeky Reanimate on this list, which is kind of interesting to me. I think this is probably fantastic playing against Reanimator, where you can actually reanimate maybe one of your opponent's creatures if they play it in a weird sequence where you're able to actually get the sorcery off before they can get their sorcery off. Hopefully the Reanimator players shouldn't be allowing for that, especially in this matchup, but you could maybe get a sneaky, cheeky little move on them with it. Also, all the rituals, things like Dark Ritual, I kind of didn't talk about enough. Cabal Ritual. I did this whole complicated thing, but you can just Dark Ritual out a Boggart Trawler on turn 1 and have a 3/1 attacker. That'll whittle down your opponent quickly. If it's not obvious, this is kind of the turn 1 win deck in Legacy. Being able to play a land and then play Dark Ritual and then 1 Lotus Petal, so like 3 to 4 cards. You kind of have to have the God Hand to some extent, but it happens a fair bit in Oops All Spells. There's just so many things that replace other things, and there's so many different copies of cards that do very similar things. The fact that they have Undercity Informer and Balustrade Spy that do the same thing is really, really important. If only one of these cards existed, it would really change the way this deck works. But this entire deck can be gotten for $424 tabletop or 285 ticks on MTGO. I will say, if you're building a Legacy deck on MTGO anyway, I don't know if I would go for budget decks that I'm covering today. I feel like with MTGO, the market is so different. I'm really covering IRL budget Legacy decks. If you're playing on MTGO anyway, you could probably spend 200 to 400, 500 ticks and get the top of the line Legacy deck in the format. So really look into what you want to build, in my opinion. And if you want to go further budget on MTGO, like a 100 ticks or less Legacy deck, if you want to see ideas for that, let me know in the comments. I would love to try to build something there for those Moto players. All right, and next up is a spicy Monogreen 12 post list that I currently play in paper. You can actually see the deck back here in 2025. So this is a deck that I have a lot of experience with. However, it has changed a fair bit over the past years or so, with additions of things like Planar Nexus being printed and then having to pick up Urza's Tower for that combo. So I can talk about this deck in detail. Let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm going to start things off. This is a spicy list. If you want to play this deck hyper competitively, there's a few things I'd recommend changing. Number 1, cut these tireless trackers for sowing micro spawns until that card probably gets banned. This is kind of a product of older Legacy. When this card was printed, it was really, really interesting. I fell in love with playing it in Legacy. It's a really long-term value game. I think this card is way too slow for Legacy right now. Same with Primeval Titan. This is definitely more of a pet deck for me than what I'd recommend for someone who's playing competitively. But I do think this deck is still very powerful, honestly, in my opinion. And I think you'll see some spicy. This is probably the spiciest card here, is Alhammarret's Archive. Now, this card was much better when Sylvan Library was also in the deck. But my thought process behind building this deck back in 2016, and I've updated it and I've changed it since, but probably still not enough. Probably Tireless Tracker probably needs to go, is the big thing. I would probably still keep the prime times personally and try to rock it, but the thought process was that green card draw was really bad. Green card draw was really bad, and lands decks were really good, and Cloud Post decks were really good about getting a fast start back then and being really powerful, but they would run out of steam if somebody, Force of Willed your prime time. You were pretty much cooked. You were done, right? So my solution was to ramp up the card draw. My solution was, you know what, I'm going to play the Tireless Trackers. I'm going to play, get those clues. I'm going to play things like Alhammarret's Archive to increase my card draw, increase my life gain from Glimmer Post, which was very, very relevant at the time to stay in that game. I'm going to play things like the One of Nissa Vital Force, which I still think is a super underrated card for this, for this deck. I'm surprised more people don't play it, honestly. Nissa Vital Force, for those who don't know, this could go in the lands deck as a 1 of, honestly. It's hard to see. It's kind of off camera at the moment. Nissa Vital Force is a 5 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker that comes in and you plus it up to 1, untapping a target land and creating a 5/5 elemental creature with haste that is still a land. However, you could also use it to -3 and return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This is great for Glacial Chasm or other effects like that, other lands of yours that get wastelanded. Or after you +1 it only takes 1/1 to then get the -6, which is the ultimate. The ultimate is you get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you get that emblem in Legacy, it's really hard to lose. I think if you lose with that emblem up, there is something either your draw RNG was atrocious or something else. You got some bad karma. Something happened that day. Because I think, yeah, once again, this deck is based around a 12-post deck, a lands deck, a Monogreen deck that wanted to draw a lot of cards to make up for its biggest weakness. One, Ugin the Spirit Dragon, just clear the field and also be a win con is fantastic. 4 crop rotation is a must. 2 Once Upon a Times just to smooth out some draws. 2 Explorers. I play Explorers to weave into that more of that Alhamrat's Archive kind of the draw thought process, the draw strategy. Just 1 Expedition map to weave things out. And another card that I think is very, very underrated is I play a 1 of Worldbreaker in most lists like this. This is a card that came out with Oath of the Gatewatch, I believe, and it's whenever you cast this spell, it's 7 mana for an Eldrazi, 5/7 with Reach, which is very relevant for blocking a lot of those flying threats. This can block, often it can block the Regent. Murktide Regent, couldn't think of it for a quick sec, but yeah, a lot of the times Worldbreaker can block a Murktide Regent, as well as be a returnable source of exiling your opponent's lands and really putting your opponent out of the game. When you cast this spell, you exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. It just offers this flexibility in game 1 that I often really, really like with Worldbreaker. Usually taking out a land or taking out a big enchantment or artifact against certain matchups. It really, really depends, obviously. You can pay 2 and a colorless mana, specifically a colorless, not a generic, to sacrifice a land with Worldbreaker in your graveyard to then return Worldbreaker to your hand. Sometimes getting lands in your graveyard is pretty relevant in this deck. I do end up playing 1 Crucible of Worlds or Walk-in Closet main board, which I think is crucial to this deck's success. I like playing 3 Spelunking. This is a little more experimental. I haven't played enough with this, but this card makes it so that all of your lands enter the battlefield untapped, which makes for an extremely gross mid-game and late game, grosser than this deck already is. But it does slow you down a little bit, I would argue, in that early game. It also allows you to draw a card and put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So it's kind of similar to it's a 3 mana Explore with the extra effect of allowing you to all of your lands for the rest of the game to enter untapped. Exploration at 3 of, it's not as important as in lands decks, but it's still very, very powerful here. 1 Emrakul to be one of your big game enders. The amount of times I've gone prime time with a Spelunking on the battlefield, prime time into grab Eye of Ugin, into like tutor Emrakul, into play it in the same turn. You can develop gross amounts of mana with this deck. Ulamog, Nulamog, fantastic card. Great ramp up spell to just restabilize. Exiling 2 target permanents upon cast is really what you're there for. I think the most awkward thing about this deck is just the opening hands. I think this is one of the most difficult decks I've ever had to pilot when it comes to opening hands and understanding what to keep, what not to keep. It has very, very clunky starts, I would say, but it has that crushing inevitability, and it can be very, very powerful in my opinion. I'm going to show you guys a quick few starting hands and mulligans to show you guys what I mean. Obviously, this is the easiest mulligan in the world. I would go ahead and mulligan this. Tapped out is also so old that it still uses old mulligan rules, so I'm going to draw the extra card there. This is a pretty solid opening hand. You have Planar Nexus into Urza's Tower, into Spelunking on 3. The Emrakul is awkward here, but I would definitely keep this. This game would probably end up going something like bottom the Forest. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then playing Forest on turn 1 to protect yourself from Wasteland. Going into turn 2, drawing a Cloud Post. Dropping the Cloud Post down on turn 2 and just passing. This is definitely a deck that is hoping your opponent isn't doing anything combo based. That's just how lands decks are, absolutely. This is a deck that I've always played 3 to 4 Mind Break traps in the sideboard for, because it just needs that early game interaction. And then on turn 3, you're probably looking at a planar Nexus into tap Cloud Post for 2, into green, into playing a Spelunking, into then playing an Urza's Tower, which now also taps for 3. So now we have 4 colorless available, which unfortunately we can't do much with. But next turn we are playing Primeval Titan on turn 4 with the filtering effect from planar Nexus. So we would go ahead and go to turn 4, draw ourselves an Urza's Tower. If we then play out the Glimmer Post here, it gives us access to less mana on this turn, but you kind of want to keep the second Urza's Tower hidden here for the next turn, because might be able to ramp up to Emrakul. You would play this, you would gain 3 life due to the Locust on the battlefield, which is relevant for sustaining and keeping alive to actually play your cards. And right now we have access to 1, 2, 5... plus 3, 8, 9 mana currently available to us this turn. You would obviously go ahead and try to filter a green and essentially try to play out your Primeval Titan. I would argue at this point it's most likely this gets countered. You would go ahead and head over to turn 5, draw another Urza's Tower, go ahead and play one of those. And now on turn 5, we have access to, I believe, 12 mana, assuming our opponent Force of Willed our Primeval Titan. We would just play our Urza's Tower and pass turn, honestly, here. Not the best showing of a game for this deck, obviously, but I wanted to show you guys a real example and not just sit here and mulligan and goldfish till I show you guys the best example. So this is an Emrakul on turn 6, which would obviously result in a game win if you make it to this point. This is a good example of one of those slower games with this deck, but also showing the inevitability of this deck. The longer the game goes on, the more likely you are to win. And I think recommending decks like this to newer players is super crucial. Show you guys one more quick hand. Here we have a new 7. I just went ahead and restarted one game. This was not fished for by any means. I would probably go ahead and play a planar Nexus on turn 1 here. Go ahead and head over to turn 2, play an Urza's Tower. This will now tap for 3. We can then go ahead and tap this, use one of it to filter, and play a Tireless Tracker on turn 2. Now giving us a sustainable engine of clues, as well as a beatdown threat, as well as card draw. And hopefully you can pull out the win from there. This has been Monogreen 12 post Cloud Post made by Petrowski. Next up is the only deck on this list which does go ahead and just pop in some shocklands, but for good reason, because we are playing Blue-Red Delver Burn. This is a Delver deck with the classic 12 lightning bolts. I don't know if classic is the right word, but something people actually have been playing recently to some decent success, as well as a ton of fun. You get to play 4 lightning bolts, 4 chain lightnings, and 4 lava spikes. For those who don't know, a basic Blue-Red Delver strategy comes down to playing a Delver of Secrets or a Dragon Rage Channeler on turn 1, and with this deck, also a Monastery Swiftspear, bringing that back for more of the burn strategy, and then beating down your opponent while also controlling them and interacting with them with things like Daze, and in this deck, Misdirection. Misdirection is a spicy budget option for Force of Will if you can't afford the playset that costs $200 to $250. Now, this deck is currently clocking in at around $300 to $350 over on TCG Players, so if you have the Force of Wills or want to shell out for the Force of Wills, I think it could be worth it, or definitely is worth it. It's a much better card. Force of Will is definitely better than Misdirection, but Misdirection is around $5 and Force of Will is around $50 a piece. I personally have played with Misdirection a fair bit while playing Stifle Knot during the Abrupt Decay Deathrite Shaman metagame. I would play 4 Force of Wills main board, as well as 1 to 2 Misdirections or Diverts. This card says you may exile a blue card from your hand rather than paying Misdirections. Hefty 5 CMC mana cost, and you can change the target of a spell with a single target. That is kind of important. This allows you to misdirect a lightning bolt if your opponent tries to throw a lightning bolt at one of your Delvers to their face or to one of their creatures. It allows you to misdirect, change the target of a Swords to Plowshares from at one of your creatures over to one of your opponent's creatures. It allows you to misdirect a counter spell over to Misdirection itself. That's probably the most common use of it. That's why it's a budget Force of Will. Things like Daze say counter target spell unless the controller pays 1. The way you do this is you use Misdirection to change the target of Daze over to Misdirection itself to counter the Misdirection, or change it to itself or change it to some other spell on the stack, and you're able to essentially the Misdirection resolves and the Daze fizzles because there is no target. So it acts as sort of a quasi Force of Will if your opponent is trying to interact with you or target you in some way. If your opponent is trying to pop off with Balustrade Spy or some sort of turn 1 combo win, you cannot. It's really difficult to interact with that with Misdirection, as opposed to Force of Will being able to do that much easier. You also don't lose 1 life from using Misdirection the same way you do lose 1 life from using Force of Will, so just something to consider there, especially with this deck since your mana base is going to consist of some shot lands. I ended up doing 4 Steam Vents, 1 Thundering Falls as a Surveil land here. Typically, you wouldn't want a Surveil land in a Delver deck like this because having that tapped mana source on turn 1 is kind of rough. However, I think when running a budget list, it kind of fulfills the purpose of being a tapped dual land as well as value, as well as getting cards in your graveyard with this deck is super important, as well as lining up your draws. I think it ends up working for this deck, even though normally you wouldn't want this. Lining up your upkeep trigger for your Delver, etc. 2 Wastelands slotted in, 4 Steam Vents, 4 Scalding Tarns, 2 Flooded Strands, 2 Islands, 1 Mountain. You want to have some basics to rely on with this deck. And then some new of the Aether Drift sort of check lands, the River Pyre Verges that tap for a red, but then also tap for a blue, but only if you control an island or a mountain, which is kind of nice. So if you have any other land, essentially any other land in your deck on the battlefield except for Wasteland, River Pyre Verge should be activated and should be viable as a second land, but it's not going to be a good land in a one-hander a lot of the time, but that can depend as well. Most of the if your opening hand is something like River Pyre Verge with your Dragon Rage Channeler as your 1-drop, you probably could go ahead and keep that and really hope to get that blue source soon, because you definitely want your blue source in this deck. Red is really important, but blue is better, let's be honest. But you have your Chain Lightnings, your Lava Spikes, your Ponders, your Brainstorm to smooth out your draws, as well as getting you value on things like Prowess on Monastery Swiftspear, your Surveils on your Dragon Rage Channeler, turning this thing into a 3/3 flyer as soon as possible, and your 2 Murktide Regents to go ahead and be that extra huge threat to close things out. And your Mishra's Bauble to help you get more things in the graveyard and get that artifact in the graveyard for Delirium for Dragon Rage Channeler, as well as checking things like what your opponent's drawing. Should you hold up your days? What are you drawing? Do you need to fetch? Should you, factor this in for your Delver trigger? The Mishra's Baubles that cost 0 mana do give you prowess on things like your Swiftspear. They do allow you to, Surveil. It's a non-creature spell for DRC, so you do get a little Surveil there. You get an extra card in the graveyard for Murktide Regents. There's so much synergy with Mishra's Bauble here. I think the Shocklands once again worked for this deck in a budget sense because you're trying to kill your opponent before they kill you in a decent tempo way. So I think you're okay sacrificing the life. If you're playing a Delver versus Delver matchup, that's where this is going to really hurt you. And that's where you kind of fall behind due to the budget. But hey, man, that's budget Legacy. This deck is only going to cost you around 300 to 350 bucks. And if you want to upgrade to Force of Wills, obviously you can, but this is a really good starting core for Legacy players. Next up is talking about one of the hardest Legacy decks I've ever personally had to pilot. Well, not this version, but a different version. I've played a fair bit of High Tide Reset because it was one of the cheapest decks you could build on MTGO for an extremely long time. I think the entire deck was buildable for like under 20 ticks at a point. Probably not anymore, but back in the day, you could build it for very cheap. Nowadays, I think it is a bit more expensive. But here we have High Tide using Time Spiral, which is definitely the most expensive card in this deck. And you might even see, I thought this was supposed to be under 500 bucks. Why is this one 600 to 800? I'll get to that there, and I'll get to it in a quick sec, okay? But this deck is all about setting up with things like Sapphire Medallion, getting your reducers down, and essentially just casting as many blue spells as possible in one turn, and then either using High Tides to ramp up your mana. This is a Storm deck. This is all about using things like High Tide, using Sapphire Medallions to get as much mana as possible, constantly untapping your mana with things like Snap to bounce a creature and untap 2 lands. If you have High Tide up, Snap becomes a mana beneficial thing. You tap 2 islands for 4 mana. If you have multiple High Tides, it gets more ridiculous. You tap 2 islands for 4, you untap them, you net positive on mana. You have things like Lorien Revealed here, which just smooth out your draws, and then later on in the game, absolutely using these to draw 3 cards is definitely something this deck will do. Mind's Desire is one of your big things to cast a lot of spells over and over again for on the cheap. It has Storm. It's 6 mana, so it's a hefty cost, but it's one of your main payoffs. Shuffle your library, then exile the top card of your library until end of turn. You may play that card without paying its mana cost. And then Time Spiral is the big one here, which costs 6 mana. Exile Time Spiral when you cast it. Each player shuffles his or her graveyard and hand into the library, and they draw 7. You tap untap up to 6 lands. So if you can get off a Time Spiral with 1 High Tide, you pay the mana, you untap everything, you net positive on mana. Untapping up to 6 lands is crazy. Usually you won't have 6 lands on the battlefield for that, but if you can, more power to you. This deck's job is really to get as many lands onto the battlefield as possible. You really want to just slow your opponent down, take things step by step, craft your hand, spend the first few turns crafting your hand and just playing your islands. You want to just play your lands, and then eventually you're looking for a spot to sort of go off, pop off, and then use something like Brain Freeze to mill out your opponent, or mill out yourself with a Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, on the battlefield. What's nice about this version of the deck with Time Spiral is you don't have to go off on your opponent's turn. I'm used to playing High Tide Reset, which is much more complicated. Everything has to be instant speed because you have to go off on your opponent's upkeep on your opponent's turn. It's really, really stressful, really frustrating. And if you brick in that one, you kind of just lose the game. If you brick in this deck, you can go at it again and try another attempt in the next turn most of the time. Well, let's go ahead and address that cost. What is that about, Petrowski? And over here, you might be able to already see. If you head over to TCG Player, you can actually see Time Spirals for $60 as opposed to the 100, which Tapped Out says they cost. Because if you change the language option off of English, you can find Time Spirals for $60 pretty consistently. I saw them earlier in the week for 50 to 60, multiple of which in Spanish, multiple of which in Japanese. So if you're willing to play with non-English cards, that's what really makes Time Spiral and really makes these decks a ton cheaper. I absolutely love playing with foreign language cards, but please, if you do this, make sure you understand what your cards do, or have your phone at the ready, or just make sure you understand the wording pretty well or are pretty practiced. With any decks where I have foreign cards, I make sure to play test in Goldfish over and over and over again until I remember, especially if I'm going to play that deck at a tournament. But that takes the playset of our Time Spirals from $400 all the way down to $200 on average-ish if you kind of be a little patient and find some good deals, knocking around $200 off the cost of this deck, taking it from $600 to $800 down to around $400 to $600, so it's still in that $500-ish range. Probably one of the more costly decks on this list, but I wanted to try to include a deck of each variety. So we ended up getting a lands deck, we ended up getting a 12-post deck, kind of lands, a full combo deck with Oops All Spells, a tempo deck with Blue-Red Delver, and then now a Storm combo deck with High Tide. And I know I said that I would only be covering 5 decks, but I have a 6th, an honorable mention. This deck is really fucking cool to me. Not made by me. This is made over by Elv M over on MTG Goldfish, so shout out to him. He did a league and went 3-1 with it. I just thought this was a very fun version of Nick Fit. Nick Fit is not particularly a powerful deck in Legacy. I'm going to be honest. It never really has been. It's been a while, but it's a fun deck, man. Nick Fit is for those people who want to play like rampy commander style of Magic in Legacy is how I've always seen it. Nick Fit players are the best. Nick Fit players are used to losing. Nick Fit players know some of the best interactions I've ever seen. And I'm not a Nick Fit player. I feel like I'm just blazing myself, but I'm not a Nick Fit player. I'd love to build one of these decks one day and try out Nick Fit because it's so interesting to me. It's such a cool deck. It's such a cool style of play. So what is Nick Fit? At its core, for my understanding, Nick Fit usually boils down to Veteran Explorer plus Cabal Therapy. So Veteran Explorer is a 1-mana green creature that says when it dies, each player may search their library for up to 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield. The players that search the library this way shuffle it, of course. This is a really powerful effect, especially just in Magic, but the downside is that it's both players. In Legacy, a lot of people don't play more than 1 basic. There's a lot of people, a lot of decks that play maybe 1 to 3 basics. When you start popping off multiple Veteran Explorers, you start getting advantages which are insane. Now, how do you get your Veteran Explorers to die? You could chump block with them and get them killed that way, but one of the best ways is with Cabal Therapy. One of the best things you can do in this deck is go something like turn 1 Forest or some other green source and go ahead and play a Veteran Explorer, and then turn 2 throw up a Cabal Therapy, name a non-land card, and then target player reveals his or her hand and discards all cards with the same name, and then you can then flash back, sacrificing your Veteran Explorer, ramping you, and then also getting another Cabal Therapy name. So you're guaranteed to usually hit at least 1 card in your opponent's hand. Really good blind names. It obviously depends on what colors your opponent plays, but Blind naming cards with Cabal Therapy is one of the most skill-based things in Legacy, in my opinion. If you see blue, usually Force of Will. If you see like a Tundra, you could go something crazy like a Stifle, a Phyrexian Dreadnought if you want to fuck over a player like me, which is kind of based. You can do a lot of things, which is a lot of fun. It's really, really skill expressive. You know, if you see an Ancient Tomb turn 1, is that going to be Moon Stompy? Is it going to be Show and Tell? Which one do you name? Do you name Show and Tell? Do you name the Omniscience? What do you do? I think it's one of the coolest cards in Legacy is that Cabal Therapy plus Veteran Explorer interaction. You just have so many cool one-ofs in this deck as well. So many cool little pieces. 3 Eternal Witnesses in Legacy. Where else do you see that? 1 Primeval Titan. You also have a combo in this deck, if I'm not mistaken, which is the reason why they play Chain of Smog. Yeah, Chain of Smog plus Witherbloom Apprentice. This is a rampy, like, fair, also combo deck, but control-y because of Cabal Therapy, but sacrificey, graveyardy. It's a weird deck. So we can see over here, Chain of Smog. Target player discards 2 cards from his or her hand. That player may copy the spell and may choose a new target for the copy. So if you target yourself with Chain of Smog and just copy it 1,000 times with Witherbloom Apprentice onto the battlefield, you discard your hand, but you also drain and gain your opponent for infinite life. Because Witherbloom says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. You can copy Chain of Smog for free infinitely for just 2 mana. So there's that little combo in there. There's things like Unearth, allowing you to bring back your Veteran Explorers after you already sacrificed them, allowing you to bring back your Witherbloom Apprentice for, you know, extra consistency, your Eternal Witnesses to grab a different creature. There's so much cool interaction. You have Diabolic Intent to sacrifice your Veteran Explorer while also tutoring for the best card in your deck. You have Green Sun Zenith, which allows you to search out Dryad Arbor on turn 1 to ramp for 1 mana, or search out something like a Grist out of your deck, or just Green Suns for a Veteran Explorer. There's been so many new cards that allow you to sacrifice creatures in really cool ways that have been added to this deck list, which I just fall in love with. Flare of Cultivation, you can sacrifice your Veteran Explorer instead of paying its mana cost, and then ramp for 4 basic lands. Turn 1, you can go Forest, Veteran Explorer, cast Flare of Cultivation, sacrifice the Veteran Explorer. You search for 4 basic lands. Your opponent maybe searches for 2. It's also really important to show that Veteran Explorer does not put the basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. Flare of Cultivation does. But Veteran Explorer puts the lands just into play, untapped. So you can go Veteran Explorer, you know, and then immediately sacrifice it or do some sort of play or get it killed in some way and play a different Cabal Ritual or Cabal Therapy, or play another Veteran Explorer to follow it up, or play cards to follow up that play. And then the land base is a whole bag of shenanigans over here. We see Beseiju, of course, very, very powerful card. We see Castle Lochthwain. We see nurturing Peatland, which helps you draw a card. Late game, 1 Overgrown Tomb, which helps with the, I assume this is a budget deck list built by him. It's 126 ticks as well total, which is honestly one of the cheaper decks we've seen on MTGO today. An Urborg, 1 Underground Mortuary, Verdant Catacombs, Yavimaya Credit Growth, very powerful card. The Phyrexian Tower, you can tap it to sacrifice a creature and add 2 blacks. You can sacrifice your Veteran Explorer to that as well. There were so many cards, weirdly, so many cards printed in Modern Horizons 3. I know, Modern Horizons 3, but so many cards printed in this set that helped out Nick Fit of all things. Which is just the coolest thing in the world to me, man. So I love this deck. I would love to see more Nick Fit players. I would love to become a Nick Fit player one day if I get cool enough. You know, you got to be a certain level of cool to play this deck. Maybe one day. But that is it. That is the final deck I wanted to ramble about today. And man, this video ended up being way longer than I expected, but it turns out I'm kind of good at yapping. I have the gift of gab, some might say. I don't know if that's a good thing, but I have it, okay? So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hopefully you enjoyed talking about Legacy, discussing Legacy. If you have comments, your own recommendations, budget deck lists, critiques of the deck list I put out today, politely, please, respectfully in the comments. I'm just trying my best here to get people into Legacy. At the end of the day, my main intention is to get people into Legacy, to love the format. I know when you're playing competitive, you know, budget and competitive do they butt heads, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think sometimes people think that, like, you cannot play a budget deck competitively, and I think you can. I think you can do it to a decent degree. Is it objectively suboptimal to some extent? Yeah, of course, right? But would you rather do something suboptimally and still be able to do it and have a ton of fun, or just not do it at all? And honestly, the answer to that question might depend on the person you are. For me personally, I would rather do something fucking suboptimally and still be able to do it and have a ton of fun. So this is how I was able to get into Legacy, was building budget decks like this. And I would have never understood how beautiful the format is without deck lists like this being presented 10 years ago. So thank you guys so much for watching. Like the video if you enjoyed it. It helps me out tremendously for a small growing channel. Subscribe if you want to see more Magic the Gathering content, legacy content, just whatever I want to talk about that day. I love the game. And just, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. I will see you guys later. Peace, Reno.